Hello and welcome to Pictorial Planet. My name's John Finch. This is Q&A number 4. I did a Q&A a few months ago, and what happens is I wait for a few videos to build up since the last Q&A, and then I go through the questions I've been asked and I try to answer them now. And I think it might be useful because a lot of us just don't have the time to go through all the questions and read all my responses. So this is a way for you to catch up on what's been asked about my videos in the recent past. Now, the last Q&A I did was just before the video about making developers like 510 Pyro and PCT, and I gave you some tips on the temperature to dissolve your developing agent on. And I was specific about Fenidone because it seemed that Fenidone could be, and we don't know why or which type of Fenidone is affected like this, but some Fenidones at least could be affected by high temperatures of PG, propylene glycol, when you dissolve it in the propylene glycol. So we talked a little bit about that. Now, a question I got asked by Powell Mazur was a very interesting question. I have a huge amount of cheap propylene glycol while tea is less available. So I'm wondering whether I could prepare a modified Pyro 510, which is my favorite staining developer, with two parts. Part 1 in glycol and the other accelerator dissolved in water as a part B that you could add when you finally mix the 510 before developing a film. That was a really interesting question. It got me thinking about that because, of course, 510 Pyro uses the TEA, which it's been dissolved in, to produce the alkalinity it needs to develop the film. So without the TEA, it doesn't have the alkalinity. So you would have to provide, of course, just as Powell mentions, a part B, which would be the accelerator. The other thing is, will the agents in 510 Pyro dissolve in propylene glycol? And I think they will. The pyrogalol, the ascorbic acid and the Fenidone should all dissolve in PG. So how would you go about making that? And I suggested that Powell test some different part Bs that you could use to make this developer. And I thought I'd also list for you right now the alkalinity of the different accelerators that we use in developers, because it might help you decide which accelerator to use. So TEA, which is used in 510 Pyro normally, when it is dissolved in water, turns alkaline and has an alkalinity, a pH of around about 9.5. Now, I've researched this on the internet. So I haven't tested all these, so I can't guarantee the exactness of this, but I'm pretty confident this is about right. So TEA has a pH of 9.5. So to simulate 510 Pyro, we would want to have a B alkaline bath accelerator around about or similar to 9.5. Why would we want to do that? Well, first of all, it will keep our development time similar because it would be the same alkalinity. So the activity of the developing agents will be the same. But also, it will keep our fine grain. And 510 Pyro is known for being very fine grained. So we want to maintain that if we can, or we're changing the whole developer, right? So TEA is 9.5 pH. The next one up would be sodium metaborate, or Codalc as it used to be known, and that's got a pH of 10. It's a very interesting alkaline accelerator, is sodium metaborate, because it buffers very well, which means it maintains its alkalinity over a longer period of time. As things are trying to change it and pull its alkalinity down or push it up, it will fight to maintain its own alkalinity, and so that's buffering in a nutshell. So a metaborate has a pH of 10, so it's slightly more alkaline than TEA, so we would expect grain to get slightly more, but with the very fine grain nature of 5,10 pyro, I imagine that wouldn't be a big issue. It would probably not be very noticeable. The next one up as an alkaline accelerator that we use often is sodium or potassium carbonate. These two are used in many developers. They are more alkaline. They have an alkalinity of 10.9, and that is now getting quite alkaline now. So we would definitely see a grain increase. We would probably see lower development times, and we'd probably see slight sharpness increase, because an increased alkaline accelerator often increases our sharpness because of the higher contrast areas in the image. So to the eye it looks sharper. Technically, if it is or not, I don't know, but there is this perceived sharpness increase. And the last one we often use is sodium hydroxide. Of course, that's caustic soda, so it's not something to be played around with, but it has a very high pH of 13, the highest of all the ones that we use generally in photography. And it's used in some high contrast developers and very sharp developers. So they are the usual alkaline accelerators we use. If we're going to make 5,10 pyro out of PG, then we would probably use metaborate, the Kodalk. I think that might be more successful. All right, so moving on. The next video to talk about is important tips on making developers. SD wanted to know how much Fenidone can be dissolved in propylene glycol, PG. Is it possible to make a 10% or stronger solution? This is a good question. Of course, if we're trying to dissolve our Fenidone into PG, it's to protect it and make it last longer, because it just doesn't deteriorate at all in PG very quickly. It should last years in that chemical. PG doesn't dissolve oxygen, so that's how it protects the Fenidone. And the problem is, how much can we dissolve? Because we may have, a good amount of Fenidone, and we want to get as much as possible into our PG. But the most I've ever heard of is 5%. I haven't heard of anyone getting more than 5% Fenidone into PG. So it comes, though, with another problem. If you're going to make 5% strength dissolved Fenidone, you have the problem of measuring such tiny amounts that are needed in developers. So many developers are using 0.1 gram of Fenidone, and 0.1 gram is a tiny amount to measure from a 5% solution. So I personally only make 1 and 2% solutions of Fenidone dissolved in PG, because I find that much easier to measure to get the accuracy I want for my 1.1 gram or 0.2 grams that I need into a solution. So that's food for thought. Maximum probably 5%, but stick to a lower dilution if you want accuracy and ease of measurement with a syringe. The next video, making your own sodium metaborate, also known as Kodalk. Excuse me. Martin Jones. A quick word of caution, he says, when storing sodium hydroxide, don't use plastic containers made of PET. Now, Martin's absolutely right, and I'm glad I can highlight this in this video today. Sodium hydroxide, caustic soda, is quite aggressive chemical, and it will melt through PET eventually, and it doesn't take that long either. So if you're keeping bottles of dilute sodium hydroxide, your best bet is to use HDPE. It's a much more resistant to sodium hydroxide and shouldn't dissolve with the chemical. Glass is also a possible solution that people use, excuse the pun. And I believe it does etch glass, but I've never seen it get through glass. I've never seen it dissolve glass. So HDPE and glass for storing your sodium hydroxide solutions. The next video is using FX55. This was part 4. Now part 4 was about some prints with our new ISO and development time. So we'd worked out the FX55 ISO or EI that we were getting, and we'd also worked out our development time for film, for FP4. Christopher Coppola, he says, I'm curious for 35mm if the varying contrasts within a roll might be better with something like Barry Thornton's 2-bath to keep the highlights under control. So Christopher's asking, when you have a roll of film and you've shot it perhaps over many days or even weeks, and on that roll are many photographs of different and varying contrasts, then use a 2-bath, he's suggesting, because that controls the contrast better on all those different negatives. In fact, I think I've said before, it's like having Ansel Adams in your developing tank, right? It develops each negative appropriately because of the way it works as a 2-bath developer. So that's very true. It's a good idea for people who want to ease their processing of a film that they've shot over multiple occasions, knowing they've got multiple contrast levels on those images. But they're not very good for the zone system. And for this particular series, the FX55 series, we were following the zone system in calculating our ISO and calculating our development times and so on. So if you are a zoney, I'm a zoney, I use the zone system, and I know many of you do too, you really need to be using a developer which has a fixed development time. You're not using it as a compensating developer because that will affect your zone system. It will detract from the accuracy of your zone system calculations. So you need a developer that you're using at a normal dilution for normal development times. So to use FX55 at its normal dilution is a good zone system developer. Of course, other good ones would be things like D76 or Dizactol or some other developers like that we've used before. They'll all work well with the zone system because they're fixed development times where you're getting N development at the end of a certain period of time with a certain agitation. And you've also calculated N+1 development times and N-1 development times, and more if necessary. So that's why we wouldn't use a 2-bath. However, very good suggestion, Christopher, when using a film and you're not using the zone system and you have this varied contrasts. I might just add that a lot of the time that I'm using the zone system with 35mm, I'm using short lengths of film that I've cut short deliberately from a bulk loader so that I can just focus on one image on those negatives and use my zone system technique. And we've talked about that in previous videos. Okay, so the next video was darkroom printing part 4, split grade printing. Now, split grade printing for me is a kind of new thing. I don't do it all the time, but I've demonstrated it and I do use it occasionally when I think it's advantageous. A lot of the time I'm still using regular printing, using regular grades, and sometimes using a different grade in a burn-in, for instance, for the sky. I might use a harder grade to increase the contrast in the clouds and things like that. But split grade printing is useful and it has its uses for sure, and I'm definitely no expert in split grade printing, so one of the great things about the internet is this social side where we all get a chance to comment and talk about things. And this was a great comment, and it's actually helped me. So it was brought up by several people: Christopher Coppola, Mike Allen, Ignatius Chadis, and Russell Sprout. All said, roughly speaking, that when they split grade, they do their grade 0 test print, which is what I did first. Remember, I did a grade 0. But then they do a grade 5 test print over the top of the grade 0 time that they found to be correct. So let's just back up a bit. They're suggesting, and I think this is a better way of doing it than I demonstrated, you do your grade 0 test print, which is the highlights. You find where your highlights start to appear, and you get that time. How long did it take? You then flash another test strip with that time using grade 0. And then you do a test strip across it of grade 5. So what you're seeing is the effect of grade 5 on top of your grade 0 time. It's very smart, and I completely missed that, and I shouldn't have. It's really the right way to do it. In fact, I think Russell Sprout added that it's widely attributed to Les McLean is this technique. So thank you, Les, for that. It's great that these techniques, I know Les McLean has offered many techniques for photography, and is a really good resource on the internet. So that's terrific that you guys mentioned that, and thank you. You've helped me move my printing forward. Francis Massin asked a question for the same video. He said, is the sequence of grades important? I mean, grade 0 before grade 5, or grade 5 before grade 0. And with your test strip, I think it is important. I think you should work out your grade 0 first. It's much easier to work that out before you do your grade 5 on top of it. However, when you're actually printing your print itself and switching grades as you expose the paper, I don't think it matters at all. There's 3 emulsions on that paper. One is particularly activated by blue light, one by blue and green, and one by green light. Those 3 emulsions will react regardless of whether you start with grade 5 or grade 0. It doesn't matter. You'll get the same print. That's my understanding. That's my belief. Good question. The next video I'll talk about is the one-stop shop developer. That developer, Ilford PQ, for film and paper. Surprising results, wasn't it? It was just a terrific developer and really nice. Lovely tonality as well. So I was very impressed that this developer would do both film and paper. Francois Massin points out that it's also called ID62, and that's absolutely right. It is ID62 or Ilford PQ. There's a question from Richard Smith, who asks, after using the mix for developing prints, do you keep the developer that was used in the tray for more days use? That's a good question on many levels. Okay, so Richard is asking, do I leave the developer out in the print tray for the next day? And I don't. And I don't do that with any of my paper developers that I use. I have a large bottle, a dark large bottle, which I pour the developer in with a funnel at the end of a session. And then this keeps it better protected against oxygenation and the obvious deterioration that happens because of oxygen. So inside the bottle, I could, if I wanted, squirt a little butane to help protect it from the air in the bottle, but I don't. I tend to use them for 2, 3, 4 days like that without making a fresh batch of paper developer. It slowly goes yellow, but it seems to work. And remember, I've talked about it before. The technique I use factorial development is a technique where you're watching for the beginnings of the midtones to start to appear. That would be things like the tone of grass. And you see that start to appear on the print, and you look at the clock, you look at the timer, and you say, okay, that was 20 seconds. And I personally multiply that by 5 to know the length of my development time. So 5 times 20 is 100, so 100 seconds. I know that that print is developed as much as I want it to be. And it's usually pretty much completely developed, as far as I can tell, by a factor of 5. Some people use 6, that's fine too. And some people bring it down to 4, and that lowers the contrast a little bit, so you can actually adjust the contrast of the print a little bit using factorial development. The most important part to me about factorial development, though, is to assess the life of my developer. When my developer starts to become over-oxygized and starts to lose its ability to develop the prints, I can tell, because when that mid-tone starts to appear, I know it was 20 seconds when it was fresh, and now it's 30 seconds. And so that developer is starting to go off. That's time for me to mix a new batch of working developer and start putting that and start using that. So that's the main reason I'm using factorial development. And I promote factorial development. I think it's a very good technique, and I think everyone should use it. So I put my developer into a bottle overnight and use it the next day, or maybe 2 or 3 days later I'll use it, and it goes on and on. You can use it 3 or 4 times before it starts to go bad and you're going to have to replace it. So I hope that's helpful. If you leave it out in a tray, it's not going to last very long. It may be okay the next day, but I think it'll be deteriorating by the 3rd day. I reckon it's done. So you're not getting as much life out of it. Okay, so the next video. Sorry, there's one more question about the ID62 or Ilford PQ developer, and it was a good question because it did help me. In the video, I use a 1 to 29 dilution to develop film, but the website, my website, says it's 1 to 19 to develop film, which is correct. Mike Callahan asked that question. Good spot, Mike, and I thank you for that, because I've been back on my website and I have adjusted the dilution. 2 things to talk about here. One, 1 plus 19 as opposed to 1 plus 29. 1 plus 19 is fine. It just develops the film much faster. And it's faster than I like. I've talked about this in my book. I like a development time that's around about the 10-minute mark. That is a nice development time because it's relaxed. It's harder to make a mistake when things are going a little bit slower. So you've got everything under control. You've time to prepare everything and make sure everything's okay for the next stage, for the stop or whatever you're going to do. The temperatures you can check and adjust because you've got time. With fast development times of 5 and 6 minutes, it's all happening very quickly. And yeah, if you're experienced, it's okay, you can do that. But for the less experienced, or the people that aren't in their dark room every other day, it's all happening rather quickly, and it's tense. So I like a slower I recommend a slower development time of around about 10 minutes. Could be 9, could be 8, could be 12, but you know, you're in that ballpark where everything's happening at a nice gentle pace and you can stay on top of everything. So I found the 1 plus 19 works very well, but it was too quick for me, and 1 plus 29 gave me my 10-minute development time or thereabouts, which was lovely. The second thing to talk about here about development dilutions is they are anything you want them to be. just because the manufacturer recommends 1 + 19, or maybe the manufacturer recommends 1 to 100. You can use 1 to 150. You could use 1 to 75. You can play with those dilutions because they're not set in concrete. And sometimes it's a good idea to play with those dilutions because you may find a development time is too long. And it's maybe a 15 or 16 minute development time. And you think, oh, it's just too long. I can't wait that long to develop a film. It's not pleasant. So you can increase the concentration of the developer and bring down the development time to a more reasonable, say, 10 minutes. So don't think that just because 510 pyro is 1 to 100 that you have to use it 1 to 100. You could use it 1 to 150 or 1 to 75. And we know we can use it at 1 to 200 and even 1 to 300. So you can use any you want as long as it gives you the results you want. And so that's the art of the photography, is coming away from the mechanical, coming away from the fixed and directed way that people are telling you how to do it, and start to add your own flavor, your own artistic angle on what you're making. And if you want a bit more contrast in your negatives, develop them for a little bit longer than somebody else. If you want a bit less contrast, develop them for less time than somebody else. There's no fixed way of doing it. It's all a little bit pliable. It's all putty in your hands, and it's there for you to model and create what you want to create at the end of the day. This question, and the last one I'll answer today, by Tim Berkeley, is he talked about factorial development. Just wondering if factorial development can compensate for the drop in developer temperatures as a session goes on in a cold darkroom. Now, it is getting cold at this time of the year. In fact, I've been working in the darkroom here for a couple of hours now, and it is quite chilly, even though I've got the heater on. So as you're working with your developers and so on, they're going to lower in temperature if you don't use heating plates. Now, I have tray heaters, photographic tray heaters, and they're very good and they're worth their money if you live in a place like Scotland where the temperatures in winter are consistently low, and so it's very difficult to maintain your developer temperature and very expensive to be keeping your darkroom heated at around about 20 degrees so you can develop. So can factorial development help you in this area? Well, it can, but there's a caveat to that. So as you are developing, for instance, say I'm at 20 degrees in my tray, and I develop my print and I look at my mid-tone and I see it start to appear, and it's 20 seconds, okay? So I know everything's good, it's normal, that's normal for me. That's why I use that figure all the time, because that's the figure I know is normal for me. So I develop my print. But then slowly but surely in the dark, the temperature is beginning to drop in that development tray. And 2 or 3 prints later, it's down to say 19 degrees. So I look and I see the mid-tones start to appear, and now they're at 25, 26 seconds. Okay, this developer is not old, so the temperature's dropping, but that's okay. I've got 26 seconds, I multiply by 5, and I get the development time I want to use for the print. Remember, I use a factorial of 5. The word of warning, or the caveat about that, is if your developer goes below 18 degrees centigrade, as a ballpark figure, 18 degrees is about as low as you want a developer to go. And chemically, I can't answer why, but it seems that when it goes below 18 degrees, it just doesn't seem to work as well, even with extended development. Now, if you look at manufacturers' development temperatures, they usually stay around about 20 degrees. That's like the standard. Sometimes they'll go up to 24. And in the old days, going back to the early 1900s, they would be down at 18, but they never went below that. And that may be because the length of time to develop was much too long. But in my experience, if I've accidentally allowed a developer to drop below 18, I'm not getting those blacks. For some reason, I just don't seem to get those blacks in my print. So 18 is as low as I'll ever go. And you know what? 99% of the time, if I see my thermometer going below 20, I switch that tray on and bring it back up to 20, maybe even push it up to 22. With paper development, you're okay to push it up to 24. A lot of people, Barry Thornton, he regularly developed over 20 degrees at 24 degrees centigrade. It was normal for him to do that. And you know, it might richen your print up. It might make those blacks a bit better. So don't be afraid to go over. Don't go crazy. Don't go up to 26, 30 degrees. That's too much probably. Maybe my friends that watch the channel from the very hot places of the world could comment on this and let me know what temperatures they develop at in their print trays, how high they allow their print trays to go. But certainly in my experience, and that's all I know, is that up to about 24 degrees is good, 20 to 24 for your prints. With your films, it's a bit different because as your temperature goes up, you've got to adjust that development time because it's going to affect the contrast of the negatives. The developer's much more active as it's going up, and so it's going to develop faster. So potentially with high temperatures, with your film, you can have way too much contrast and be overdeveloped and find it very difficult to print. And I'll just add finally, if you are in a hot climate and you find it difficult to keep your temperatures down for developing film, D23. I recommend D23. It used to be known as a tropical developer because it can develop at high temperatures without being detrimental to the overall tonality of your film. So D23, very simple developer, very easy to make. There's videos on my channel of how to make that, so go for it in these hot climates. So that's all there is to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed that. The feedback I've had so far is that these Q&As are useful, that you enjoy hearing some of these responses that you haven't had time to read. So thanks very much for watching. I want to thank my patrons, of course, because they bring you this channel every week. I want you all to thank my patrons for bringing you this channel every week. If you want to become a patron and help in supporting this channel and the writing of my new book, then please do go to patreon.com/John Finch. You'll see me there and you'll be able to become a patron of the channel. Thank you very much. I think that's all I have to say, except give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next week.